The mansion always smelled the same at that hour. Polished wood warmed by hidden vents, citrus cleaner that clung to marble, and a faint, expensive floral note drifting from somewhere deeper inside, as if the building itself refused the ordinary scent of morning. She arrived before the sun fully settled into the windows, when the city outside still looked undecided, and the streetlights had not yet surrendered to daylight. Her shoes made almost no sound on the service path beside the hedge, the route the staff used because the front steps were reserved for people whose names were said out loud. She let herself in through the side entrance with a key that fit only certain doors, the kind of key that reminded you what you were allowed to touch. Inside, the air was cooler and drier, the silence thick with the quiet work of machines. She hung her coat in the narrow staff corridor where the walls were painted a forgiving beige, nothing like the wide, bright hallways that guests would see. The corridor had the hum of laundry rooms and the distant whisper of a vacuum somewhere upstairs, a hidden nervous system keeping the house immaculate. She tied her apron with practiced fingers, smoothing the fabric against her waist as if she could flatten her thoughts the same way. Her name tag was already pinned, but she still checked it, the small rectangle of plastic that made her identity legible only within the limits of her job. She began where she always began, the ground floor sitting room that faced the garden. The windows were tall enough to make the outside world look like a framed painting. The furniture seemed too perfect to be used, cushions arranged with a precision that suggested someone's mood could be measured in centimeters. She dusted the mantel, careful around the porcelain figures that never moved, the silver-framed photos turned at an angle that caught the light without showing the glass fingerprints. The house held so many traces of human life. Pictures, books, a shawl left on the arm of a chair, but none of it felt alive. It was like walking through a museum that happened to breathe. As she worked, she kept her movements small and efficient. There was a way the senior housekeeper liked things done, and a way she liked people to exist inside the house. Quietly, predictably, without bringing any extra shape to the air. The maid had learned that early. You could scrub a floor until it reflected the chandelier and still be scolded for leaving a streak of water where no one would ever look. It wasn't really about cleanliness. It was about control. She wiped the table legs, the edges, the underside where dust liked to hide, and she felt the familiar pressure behind her eyes. Not tears, not exactly, but a fatigue that accumulated when your best efforts were treated like baseline expectation. In the kitchen, the staff moved around each other with the cautious choreography of people who understood invisible lines. One of the younger cleaners nodded at her. A quick, apologetic gesture as if greeting her too warmly might be noticed and punished. The cook was already organizing ingredients in silence, the knives aligned, the herbs rinsed and resting. There was no casual conversation, no laughter. Even the clink of a spoon against a bowl sounded too loud, quickly dampened by the softening habit of those who did not want to be heard. She filled a bucket with warm water and the right amount of cleanser, the one that didn't leave streaks, and carried it toward the hallway where the polished floors extended like a promise. As she knelt to wipe near the baseboards, she caught a glimpse of herself in the reflection. Dark hair pinned back, face bare, eyes focused downward. The reflection was distorted by the shine, making her look like someone passing through rather than someone who belonged. That was the first imbalance of the day, the subtle shift that always came before something heavier, the awareness that she could be erased by the simple act of someone looking past her. The family began to surface gradually, not all at once, but in fragments. A woman's perfume drifted down the stairs before the woman appeared, announcing her presence like a warning. When the woman finally descended, robe tied loosely, she did not look at the maid. Her gaze moved over the corridor the way someone might scan a weather report, checking conditions, confirming that everything was as it should be. The maid lowered her head slightly, not out of reverence, but out of habit. It was easier to be overlooked than misread. "Good morning," she offered softly. The words meant to be polite, harmless. No response. The woman's phone was already in her hand, her thumb scrolling, her face tightening at something on the screen. She stepped around the bucket without slowing down, the hem of her robe brushing the air as if even that contact was too much. The maid stood to move the bucket out of the way, and the motion drew the attention of another staff member, a man in a pressed uniform whose job was to open doors that were already heavy and to stand in corners with a posture that suggested dignity could be worn like clothing. He glanced at her with a look that was not cruel, but practiced, the look of someone who knew where he stood and wanted her to remember where she stood too. A small tilt of his chin, an unspoken reminder to keep the hallway clear. She murmured an apology anyway, even though she had done nothing wrong. The apology slipped out like breath. She moved toward the dining room to prepare it for breakfast service. The table was long enough to make a family feel like separate islands. She adjusted the place settings, aligning forks and knives, checking that the napkins were folded exactly as expected. Each chair sat heavy and ornate, carved wood that had likely never been moved by the hands that owned it. In the center, a floral arrangement sat in a crystal vase, the petals so fresh they seemed unreal. She wondered, as she often did, what it cost to keep flowers looking like they had been plucked from perfection every morning, and how many hours of someone's labor were exchanged for that softness. When the family members finally entered, their footsteps were confident, as if the floor existed to support them specifically. A young man, older than a boy, younger than a man with responsibilities, sat without acknowledging the table had been prepared by anyone. He pulled a chair back, the wood scraping slightly, and frowned at the sound like the house had offended him. Another family member came in speaking quietly to someone on a headset, business language spilling into the room, the tone measured and impatient. The maid stepped back to the edge of the room, hands folded, presence reduced to utility. One of them reached for a glass, found it not to his liking, and set it down with a sharper motion than necessary. It wasn't thrown, it wasn't dramatic, but it carried the casual entitlement of someone used to being accommodated instantly. The maid moved forward, replacing the glass with another without being asked, her fingers careful not to shake. She told herself it was only a glass, only a preference, only a moment. Yet the body absorbed these moments and stored them in the shoulders, in the jaw, in the way you started to anticipate displeasure before it arrived. The senior housekeeper passed through, her gaze sharp and searching. She scanned the room the way a judge scanned a defendant, looking for a flaw that would justify correction. The maid felt her stomach tighten. The senior housekeeper's power was not large in the grand scale of the mansion, but it was immediate. She could decide whose hours were cut, whose mistakes were recorded, whose name was spoken with disapproval to the people upstairs. She paused near the maid and leaned in slightly. "Remember," she said in a low voice, "we are here to make things easy for them, not to be noticed." The words were simple, almost gentle, but they carried the weight of instruction passed down through years of service. Make things easy. Disappear. The maid nodded, swallowing the small protest that rose in her chest. She wanted to say that being unseen did not make the work lighter, that invisibility was its own kind of burden. But she did not say it. She had rent due. She had groceries to count. She had learned the price of speaking. As the breakfast continued, she moved like a shadow, refilling coffee, clearing plates, wiping a spot on the table that no one else seemed to notice. She watched the family's faces without meaning to, studying the effortless way their mornings began with abundance and ended with demands. She felt envy in a quiet, ashamed way, not for their wealth exactly, but for the assumption behind it, the belief that the world would adjust itself to them. When the room emptied and the last chair was pushed back, the maid let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The silence returned, but it didn't feel peaceful. It felt like a verdict. She began collecting dishes, stacking them carefully, and she noticed her own reflection again in the polished silver tray. Blurred, distorted, present only as an outline. She held the tray steady and told herself, with a firmness that surprised her, that she was still here. She was not a ghost. Even if the house didn't see her, she could see herself, and for that moment, the thought settled like a small stone of resolve in her pocket, something she could carry through the day without anyone taking it away. The mansion shifted after breakfast in a way that was almost imperceptible to anyone who didn't live inside its routines. The family had left behind the faint warmth of their plates, the scattered crumbs that looked like accidents but were still evidence, the lingering scent of coffee that never quite belonged to the staff. Once the dining room cleared, The house returned to its more honest rhythm. Footsteps that didn't want to be heard, doors that closed softly. The steady pulse of work continuing in the background as if the luxury upstairs depended on silence below. She carried the last tray to the kitchen with the careful balance of someone who had learned to anticipate obstacles even in familiar hallways. Her shoulders set in a posture that was both respectful and defensive. In the kitchen, steam rose from the industrial sink as dishes soaked, and the air was thick with detergent and heat. The cook spoke in brief instructions without looking up, and the younger cleaner rinsed glassware with the tense concentration of someone afraid of leaving spots. The maid rolled up her sleeves and joined the line of quiet tasks, hands moving automatically. Scrape, rinse, stack, until the work became a kind of numbness. It was easier when her mind was occupied. It was harder when it drifted toward the small humiliations that collected like dust in corners no one cared to see. When the last of the breakfast plates were shelved, she returned to the main floor with fresh cloths and a spray bottle, following the day's checklist that lived in her memory more than on paper. The sitting room needed resetting, the hallway mirrors needed polishing, and the powder room by the library always required extra attention because guests used it as if cleanliness were self-renewing. She moved through the rooms the way she always did, reading spaces for signs of disruption. A cushion pressed too deeply, a magazine left open, a water ring on a side table. Each sign meant someone had been there without having to consider the effort of restoring order afterward. The house asked for perfection the way it asked for light, automatically, constantly, without gratitude. Near the bottom of the stairs, she paused to wipe a smudge from a framed photograph on a console table. The glass was cool under her cloth, and the faces behind it smiled with an ease that made her chest tighten. They looked like people who had never been instructed to shrink. She adjusted the frame by a fraction of an inch, aligning it with the edge of the table, because she had learned that precision could sometimes protect her from criticism. Still, she could feel the senior housekeeper's presence even when she wasn't in the room, as if disapproval had its own scent. The minor incident began the way most humiliations did in that place, without drama, without malice that could be clearly named, just a small collision between her body and someone else's entitlement. She had been sent to the coat closet near the formal entryway to reorganize it, because a family member had complained about clutter. The closet was larger than her entire bedroom at home, lined with polished wood and brass hooks, holding coats that smelled of expensive cologne and cold air. She lifted each garment with careful hands, spacing them evenly, turning the hangers so they faced the same direction. She didn't know who had decided that hangers needed to look orderly, but she obeyed the logic anyway, because in that house logic was less important than appearance. As she reached for a heavy wool coat near the back, one of the family members, an adult relative whose name she heard only in passing, entered the entryway with quick, impatient steps. The person carried a small bag and spoke on the phone, voice low but clipped, moving toward the closet as if the space belonged only to them. The maid, half inside the closet, tried to make herself smaller. She murmured a soft apology and shifted her bucket aside, hoping the person would pass without noticing her. Instead, the person pulled at a coat sleeve abruptly, not realizing the maid's hand was still holding the hanger. The sudden tug yanked the hanger free, the metal hook scraping against the wooden rod with a sharp sound. The coat slipped, brushing the maid's shoulder, and the hanger snapped down, striking the rim of her bucket. The bucket tipped, water sloshing outward in a fast, humiliating wave that splattered across the glossy entryway floor and, worse, caught the edge of the person's polished shoe. Time slowed in the way it always did when shame arrived. The water spread thinly over the marble, shimmering under the chandelier like a stain that announced itself. The maid's heart jumped into her throat. She grabbed for the bucket, righting it too late, her fingers suddenly clumsy. The person stopped talking mid-sentence on the phone, looking down with a sharp expression that carried annoyance more than surprise. It wasn't the spilled water that felt unbearable. It was the immediate assumption that the mess existed because she existed. The person stepped back, carefully, as if the wet floor were something contagious. "Seriously?" they said, not loudly, but with enough edge that the word felt like a slap. They ended the call with a quick tap and looked at her the way one looked at an inconvenience. Watch what you're doing. The maid's mouth opened, then closed. She wanted to explain that the coat had been pulled, that she had been trying to move out of the way, that the bucket had been stable until it was struck. But explanation was dangerous. Explanation sounded like accusation, and accusation was a privilege she didn't have. She lowered her gaze and said the safest thing. "I'm sorry. I'll clean it right away." Her cheeks burned as she knelt on the marble, pressing cloths down to absorb the water. The coldness seeped through the fabric of her uniform to her knees. She worked quickly, aware of the person standing above her, aware of the shoe that had been splashed, aware of the way humiliation made the air feel heavier. The person sighed, an exaggerated sound meant to communicate inconvenience, and walked away without another word. The maid stayed on the floor until the marble no longer reflected the spill. She thought it would end there, as most small incidents did. Cleaned up, swallowed, filed into the quiet archive of indignities she carried. But the house had a way of making minor disruptions echo. As she wrung out the cloth in her bucket, she heard footsteps approaching from the hallway that led to the private office wing. They were measured footsteps, unhurried, with the kind of certainty that came from ownership rather than duty. The staff corridor had gone still, as if the house itself had paused to listen. The billionaire owner appeared at the edge of the entryway, not surrounded by ceremony, just present in a way that made the space seem to tighten. He wore a simple shirt that still looked expensive because it fit perfectly, and his expression was neutral, almost tired. He glanced at the damp cloth in her hands, the bucket, the faint sheen left on the marble. His gaze flicked briefly toward her face, not lingering long enough to become familiarity, but long enough for her to feel exposed. Behind him, the senior housekeeper arrived with the quick alertness of someone who sensed authority. Her eyes darted to the floor, then to the maid, and the maid could almost see the judgment forming before any words were spoken. The billionaire didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask what happened. He simply took in the scene and made a decision the way some people ordered coffee. "Make sure the entryway is dry," he said, tone calm, as if he were commenting on the weather. Then, to the housekeeper, "And put signs down when you're mopping. I don't want anyone slipping." It was reasonable. It was even, on the surface, protective. Yet the maid felt the sting of it anyway, because the words landed as a correction addressed to the system, not as an understanding of her. The concern was about liability, about someone important slipping, not about her kneeling in wet uniform with her pride soaked through. His gaze moved past her almost immediately, already shifting to whatever waited in his office, and he continued walking. His presence lasted only seconds, but the effect lingered, like a draft after a door closes. The senior housekeeper waited until he was gone, then exhaled as if holding back frustration. "This area must always be spotless," she murmured, voice tight with the strain of maintaining standards that weren't hers but that she defended like armor. "You know better." The maid nodded again. She didn't argue that she had been reorganizing, that someone had pulled a coat, that she had been careful. She simply accepted the correction because acceptance was the currency that kept her employed. She placed a small warning sign at the edge of the entryway, though the floor was already nearly dry, and she watched the bright yellow plastic look absurd beneath the chandelier. It was a symbol of caution meant for people who rarely had to be cautious. When she returned to the staff corridor, her hands smelled of detergent and damp cloth. Her knees ached faintly, and the humiliation sat in her chest like something unfinished. The younger cleaner glanced at her and offered a sympathetic look, but said nothing. Sympathy, too, had to be quiet here. The maid washed her hands, then dried them slowly, as if the careful motion could restore something she had lost on the marble floor. She resumed her routine, polishing mirrors, wiping banisters, straightening objects that would never thank her for their alignment. Yet something had shifted inside her. The incident had been small, almost forgettable to the people above, but it had reminded her of how fragile her footing was. A spill, a complaint, a casual instruction from the owner, and the shape of her day changed. The billionaire hadn't saved her, hadn't condemned her, hadn't even truly seen her. He had simply altered the atmosphere with a few words, and everyone adjusted around them. By late morning, the entryway was spotless again. the marble shining as if nothing had happened. That was the house's talent, to erase disruptions until only the people who caused them carried the memory. As she stood back to inspect her work, she let herself feel a quiet, contained grief for the dignity she had to ration. Then she drew a steady breath, smoothed her apron, and returned to the next task with the discipline of someone who understood that survival here depended on endurance, not recognition. The day after the spill, the house felt more watchful, as if the marble had remembered being embarrassed and had decided to punish whoever carried the memory. She arrived at the same early hour, the hedges still dark with night moisture, the service entrance still smelling faintly of bleach and cold metal. Nothing in the mansion's face suggested change, yet she sensed it in the way the staff moved. Shoulders slightly tighter, voices even lower, eyes darting more often toward the main hallway. Small incidents didn't disappear here. They softened into rumor, into quiet conclusions drawn by people who needed someone else to be wrong so they could feel safe. She went straight into her tasks, trying to reclaim the comfort of routine. In the linen room, she folded towels into neat thirds, aligning edges until they looked identical, because order was one of the few things she could create without asking permission. She replaced soaps in the guest bathrooms, checked that each bottle faced outward as if presenting itself. She polished the brass fixtures until her fingers smelled metallic beneath the lemon cleaner. With each motion, she told herself she would be careful, invisible, perfect enough to be left alone. But perfection in that house didn't buy peace. It only raised the expectation that you could keep being perfect without ever needing anything in return. Mid-morning, the senior housekeeper sent her toward the upstairs corridor to refresh the master suite sitting area and the adjacent guest room that was sometimes used for visiting relatives. The upstairs air was cooler, filtered, and quieter, as if sound itself had been redesigned. Carpets muted her steps and made her feel like she was walking on something that didn't want to acknowledge weight. She carried a small caddy of cloths and polish, and with it the strange awareness that she was allowed into these private spaces only as long as she left no trace. The owner's world was full of personal objects, books with gold-embossed spines, a watch set in a velvet tray, a jacket draped over a chair like a casual statement, but none of them belonged to her even in the smallest way. Her job was to touch without touching, to restore without altering. She started in the guest room. The bed was made with crisp linen that smelled of expensive detergent and heat from the pressing machine. The curtains were half drawn, letting in a pale light that made the room look pristine and empty at once. She dusted the side tables, checked the bathroom, refilled the tissue box. When she finished, she stepped into the hallway and noticed, for the first time, that the small decorative tray near the stair landing was missing something. It was a delicate detail, a little carved dish where guests sometimes left keys or cufflinks, but she couldn't be sure what had been there before. She told herself it was nothing. In a place like this, objects were always appearing and disappearing, moved by hands with authority, or by staff adjusting displays to match the season. She continued toward the master suite sitting area, where a faint scent of cologne lingered in the air like a signature. She was wiping the glass of a tall, framed painting when the senior housekeeper appeared at the far end of the corridor. Her face looked composed, but her eyes had sharpened into that specific expression that meant something was already decided. She didn't hurry. She never did when she was about to correct someone. The calm was part of the power. Behind her, another staff member hovered, a junior cleaner who looked uneasy, hands clasped in front of her uniform as if holding herself together. "Have you been in the guest room?" the senior housekeeper asked, voice low enough to keep the corridor quiet, but not soft enough to be kind. The maid's fingers paused on the cloth. "Yes," she said. "I just finished refreshing it." The senior housekeeper nodded as if confirming what she already suspected. "A piece is missing," she said. "A small watch. It was left on the tray by the stairs yesterday evening. It's not there now." The words landed with a cold clarity that made the maid's stomach drop. A missing watch in a mansion was not just a missing object. It was an accusation that could rearrange a life. She felt heat rise to her face, and for a moment she didn't know what to do with her hands. She held the cloth as if it could defend her, as if cleanliness could prove innocence. By lunchtime, The rumor had traveled downstairs like smoke through vents. In the kitchen, the cook's hands moved faster, as if speed could distance her from involvement. The younger cleaner avoided meeting the maid's eyes. A man who usually greeted her with a nod suddenly seemed busy studying the pantry shelves. The maid felt herself shrinking under the weight of quiet judgment, not spoken aloud but present in the way bodies angled away from her, in the way conversations paused when she entered. She understood then how easily a person could become a cautionary tale. It wasn't about whether she had done something wrong. It was about everyone else needing reassurance that the system was safe, that the house's order could be defended. Blaming one person was simpler than admitting vulnerability. Later in the afternoon, she was sent to wipe fingerprints from the glass doors near the study. The corridor outside the study carried a different kind of silence, heavier and more protected. She could hear muffled voices from inside, businesslike, measured. The billionaire owner was there. She knew, because the energy around his presence always rearranged the staff's movements. People stepped more carefully, corrected themselves faster, as if his proximity made mistakes more costly. She was cleaning the lower section of the glass when the study door opened. Two men stepped out, one holding a folder, the other speaking in a low voice that faded as they walked away. The billionaire followed them to the doorway, listening with the slight impatience of someone whose time was valued by everyone around him. Then his gaze landed on the maid, kneeling with her cloth, and the senior housekeeper approaching from the hall behind her like a shadow with purpose. The housekeeper spoke first, her voice respectful but firm. "Sir, we've had an issue," she said. "A watch is missing. It was left on the landing tray. She was assigned the corridor this morning." The maid's breath caught. She remained on her knees because standing too quickly felt like panic, and panic looked like guilt. She looked up just enough to meet the billionaire's eyes briefly, then lowered her gaze again. Her heart beat hard, not because she expected rescue, but because she felt how quickly a life could be reduced to a single accusation. The billionaire's expression didn't change much, which was its own kind of power. He glanced at the maid, then at the housekeeper. "Have you checked her supplies?" he asked, tone neutral. "Yes," the housekeeper replied. "Nothing found. We're checking other areas." He nodded slowly, as if the matter were a small disruption in the day's schedule rather than a threat to someone's livelihood. "We can't have this happening," he said. Not angrily, not loudly, but with a calm finality that implied standards mattered more than explanations. His gaze returned to the maid for a moment longer this time, but it carried the distance of assumption, the look of someone who had seen incompetence, carelessness, and occasional dishonesty in staff before, and who categorized problems quickly to preserve efficiency. "I want everyone reminded of protocol," he added. "If personal items are found, they go directly to the housekeeper's office. No exceptions." It was a reasonable policy. It also landed like a judgment. The maid felt the words settle over her like a lid. In his mind, she could already be part of the reason the reminder was necessary. He didn't ask her what she had seen. He didn't ask whether anyone else had been near the landing. He addressed the situation as a management issue, and management issues were solved by tightening rules, not by listening to the lowest voice in the hallway. The senior housekeeper nodded, satisfied to have authority reinforced. The billionaire turned back toward his study, already moving on. The door closed with soft finality, leaving the maid with the echo of his calm concern. Concern for the house, for order, for reputation. Not concern for her. When the corridor emptied, the maid stood slowly, her knees stiff. She stared at the glass she had been cleaning, at her faint reflection layered over the garden outside. For a moment she looked like part of the scenery, another detail to be maintained. She felt anger rise, quiet but real, and beneath it something more painful. The recognition that fairness was not built into this place. It was granted selectively, like access to certain doors. Innocence didn't protect you when you were already seen as replaceable. By evening, the watch still hadn't been found, but the day's work continued as if the house had no space for moral discomfort. The maid finished her tasks with a steadiness that surprised her, because she had learned that breaking down in a mansion only made the floor harder to clean. When she finally returned her supplies to the closet and untied her apron, She held her head level. She couldn't control the rumors or the assumptions, but she could control the dignity of her own movements. As she stepped out through the service entrance into the cooling air, she let herself breathe fully, tasting the ordinary night outside. The accusation had marked her, but it had not erased her. She walked home carrying both fear and resolve, and for the first time she understood that surviving this house would require more than silence. It would require holding onto her truth even when no one else rushed to protect it. The day after the accusation, the mansion's silence felt less like calm and more like surveillance. She arrived with the same early discipline, the same controlled steps through the service entrance. But her body carried a new tension that didn't belong to fatigue alone. Even the air in the staff corridor seemed to press closer, scented with starch and disinfectant, as if cleanliness could keep suspicion from spreading. She hung her coat and tied her apron, fingers moving with practiced precision. Yet her chest stayed tight, a quiet reminder that one missing object had made her name feel provisional. No one spoke about the watch directly, not in full sentences, not with the kind of clarity that could be challenged. The staff didn't need to. Their caution showed in the way eyes slid past her face, in the way conversations softened when she stepped into a room, in the way a broom paused mid-sweep as if her presence had changed the rules of movement. The senior housekeeper gave her instructions without warmth, clipped and efficient, as if neutrality were the fairest thing she was willing to offer. The maid nodded to every task, answering softly, keeping her posture composed. She understood the performance expected of her: gratitude for employment, quiet obedience, and an acceptance that innocence was not a shield when people wanted the comfort of a culprit. Her morning passed in manageable fragments. She dusted the library shelves, careful not to disturb the heavy scent of leather-bound books and expensive wood. She polished the hallway mirrors until her own reflection became less visible, reduced to a blur behind shine. She replaced fresh flowers in a small vase near the sitting room, fingers gentle around the stems, because even beauty here was arranged by someone else's standards. Each task felt like a test she hadn't agreed to take, and she was painfully aware that any small mistake, an uneven cushion, a missed fingerprint, could become proof of a larger moral failure in someone's imagination. By early afternoon, her legs began to ache the way they always did when she pushed herself to move quickly enough to avoid being noticed and perfectly enough to avoid being corrected. She told herself she could endure. Endurance was what she had practiced for years, the slow training of swallowing discomfort until it became routine. Still, there was a weight in her today that routine couldn't lighten. A sense that she had been pushed slightly out of her own humanity, reduced to a job title that could be blamed without consequence. She felt it in the way she held her breath near certain hallways, and in the way her hands trembled faintly when she reached for glass. When she finally stepped into the staff break area for a brief pause, she did so with the guilty caution of someone stealing time. The break room was small, windowless, and painted in the same practical beige as the corridor. A kettle sat on a counter beside mismatched mugs. A clock ticked loudly on the wall, reminding everyone that rest was measured and permitted only in narrow doses. She poured herself water and leaned against the counter, letting the coolness settle her throat. For a moment, she allowed her shoulders to drop. She thought of home, of a cramped apartment that smelled faintly of cooking oil and laundry soap, of bills stacked in a drawer, of a mother who worried too much and apologized too often. The thought came with a dull ache, because it wasn't only financial pressure that kept her in the mansion. It was the fear of falling into a life where even small stability could vanish. She had promised herself she would keep this job as long as she could, that she would not let pride ruin what necessity demanded. Yet pride had a way of returning quietly, not as arrogance but as the basic human need to be seen without being judged. Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket, a vibration that startled her as if she'd been caught doing something forbidden. She hesitated, then pulled it out, glancing at the screen. Her sister's name lit up, and a wave of relief hit her so suddenly it almost hurt. She answered quickly, lowering her voice without thinking, the way she always did in places where her personal life felt unwelcome. Her sister's voice sounded strained, the kind of strain that meant she was trying to hold herself together for someone else. The maid listened, her brow tightening as she heard about their mother's fatigue. A doctor appointment moved earlier, the cost of medication that always seemed to rise at the worst time. The maid's throat tightened. She pressed her fingers to her forehead, trying to keep her breathing even. She murmured reassurances, promising she would send what she could, promising she would call later, promising the kind of hope that had become their family's shared habit even when hope felt thin. As she spoke, her eyes stung unexpectedly. It wasn't dramatic grief, not the kind that demanded attention. It was quiet, contained, the kind that made you blink harder and swallow more often. She turned slightly toward the wall, as if facing away could hide the softness in her expression. In that moment she was not a maid, not a suspected thief, not a name tag in a hallway. She was simply a daughter trying to be steady for the people who depended on her. The door to the break area opened. She didn't notice at first because her attention was wrapped around her sister's voice, but the air shifted, and she felt it the way you feel someone step into your personal space without permission. She lowered her voice further, instinctively protective, and ended the call quickly after a final promise. When she turned, she saw the person who had entered. A woman from the household's social orbit, someone she had seen drifting through rooms as if the house were a hotel designed for her comfort. The woman wasn't family exactly, but she belonged to that tier of proximity where staff were expected to perform invisibility. Her hair was perfectly arranged, her clothes effortless in a way that signaled money without needing to announce it. She looked at the maid with mild interest, the expression of someone who had found an unexpected object in a familiar place. The maid straightened at once, wiping her eyes quickly with the back of her hand, ashamed of having been human where she might be witnessed. "Sorry," she said automatically, though she didn't know what she was apologizing for. The woman's lips curved slightly. Not a smile, not quite, but a knowing softness. "No need," she said. Her tone was polite, almost sweet, but her gaze lingered on the maid's face as if cataloging something. "Rough day." The maid felt her cheeks burn. She wanted to say it was private, that it was none of anyone's business, that she was allowed to be tired and worried like any other person. Instead, she gave the safest response. "Just a quick call," she said, voice controlled. "I'm fine." The woman nodded slowly, as if she already had what she needed. She reached for a mug, poured tea with unhurried movements, and glanced again at the maid's phone before looking away. It was a small glance, easy to deny if accused, but the maid felt exposed. She could almost see the story forming in the woman's mind. The maid whispering on the phone in a staff room, eyes watery, the kind of scene that could be twisted into something suspicious. In a house where a watch could disappear and an employee could become the most convenient explanation, private emotion could be reinterpreted as guilt, as manipulation, as drama. The maid left the break area quickly, her water untouched. She walked back into the corridor with her head lowered slightly, heart beating hard. The call had steadied her for a moment, and now it felt like another vulnerability she had accidentally displayed. She resumed her tasks with renewed urgency, folding linens, wiping counters, moving through spaces with the careful neutrality of someone trying to erase her own presence. It didn't take long for the consequences to arrive, because gossip in a mansion traveled the way perfume did. Quietly, clinging to air, arriving before you did. In the kitchen, she heard two staff members fall silent as she approached. In the laundry room, the junior cleaner who usually offered small kindnesses avoided her gaze completely. The maid felt her stomach turn, a slow, sinking recognition. People weren't just discussing the watch anymore. They were discussing her. Later, when she carried a basket of fresh towels toward the main hallway, she heard the woman's voice from behind a partially open door. Low, intimate, the tone used for sharing something that made the speaker feel important. The maid couldn't catch every word, but she caught enough. "I saw her, on the phone, crying. You know how it looks, after what happened." The maid kept walking, but her face burned as if the words had touched her skin. The story was already being flattened. Her mother's illness, her fear, her fatigue. None of it mattered. In that house, emotion could only be interpreted through power. If someone with money cried, it was called stress. If someone without it cried, it was called instability or worse, a tactic. By late afternoon, The senior housekeeper summoned her to a small side office near the service corridor, the room where reprimands were delivered in tidy sentences. The maid stood with her hands clasped, trying to keep her breathing steady. The housekeeper didn't accuse her outright, but her questions had the sharpness of suspicion. Why she was on the phone during work hours, whether she had been in the corridor near the landing again, whether she understood how appearances affected trust. The maid answered carefully, explaining that it had been a brief break and a family matter. Her voice stayed calm, but inside she felt something tighten into quiet anger. She was being asked to apologize not for wrongdoing, but for being seen as a person. Word of it reached the billionaire in the same reduced form that everything about her seemed to reach him now. She didn't hear the conversation, but she felt its effect. When she passed through the hallway near the study, she sensed a pair of eyes on her. She glanced up briefly and saw him at a distance, speaking with someone, pausing for a fraction of a second as his gaze moved over her. There was no warmth there, no cruelty either, just the faint hardening of assumption. The look of a man presented with a simplified version of events. Missing watch, crying maid, staff tension. His life had taught him to read problems quickly and manage them efficiently. People like her were rarely granted complexity. The maid continued walking, basket balanced against her hip, spine straight. She felt her throat tighten, not with tears this time but with the effort of holding herself together. She understood something with sudden clarity. Compassion in this house was conditional. It depended on who you were, how useful you were, how easily your story could be ignored. She could not afford to be misunderstood again, yet misunderstanding seemed built into the structure of the place. Still, as she returned to the laundry room and began sorting towels with methodical hands, she made herself a quiet promise. She would not let gossip define her inner life. If she had to survive in a house that didn't see her, she would learn to see herself with enough steadiness to endure the blindness of others. By the time the week's rhythm settled back into place, the mansion had already rewritten her into a simpler version of herself. Not the woman who measured her hours in bus schedules and grocery lists, not the daughter who counted medication costs in silence, but the maid who had been around when something went missing, the maid who had been seen on the phone with wet eyes. That version required no context, no sympathy. It fit neatly into the house's need for order, because suspicion was another way of keeping people in their lanes. She felt it most in the way the senior housekeeper moved now. Closer, quieter, more deliberate. The woman's name was Elena, though staff rarely used it unless they were speaking about her in a careful tone. Elena had the posture of someone who had learned to turn exhaustion into discipline. Her hair was always pinned back tightly, her uniform immaculate, her clipboard held like a badge. When she walked, doors seemed to anticipate her. When she paused, the corridor held its breath. She wasn't loud, and she wasn't openly cruel, but she had built her survival on a strict economy of control. The house rewarded those who kept problems small, and Elena's idea of a problem was anything unpredictable. Mess, emotion, questions, people who wanted to be seen. That morning Elena assigned her to work alongside a newer staff member for the first half of the day, and the instruction felt less like support and more like supervision disguised as teamwork. The younger girl, Sophia, carried her supplies with both hands as if afraid of dropping even the air. She was barely out of school, her cheeks still rounded with youth, her eyes too expressive for a house that preferred blank faces. Sophia looked at the maid the way someone looks at the only person in a room who feels familiar, and it made the maid cautious. Admiration could be kind, but it could also become another thing people used against you. They moved through the main floor together, wiping glass, straightening the sitting room, polishing the side tables that always seemed to gather fingerprints overnight even when no one remembered touching them. Sophia followed her lead closely, watching her hands, mirroring her pace. The maid tried to keep her work calm and steady, not too fast, not too slow. She didn't want Elena to interpret competence as overconfidence or carefulness as delay. In that house, every trait could be misread if someone decided you needed to be corrected. Sophia broke the silence first, in a whisper that sounded like a secret offered carefully. "You always know what to do," she said, eyes lowered toward the cloth in her hands. "Even when everyone is tense." The maid's throat tightened. She knew what Sophia was really referring to, the way the air shifted around her since the missing watch, since the rumor about her phone call. She kept her face neutral. "You learn," she replied softly. "You follow the checklist. You don't rush." Sophia nodded, but her expression held something warmer than simple agreement. It was loyalty in its earliest form, the instinct to choose a side when the room has already chosen against someone. The maid wanted to tell her not to, wanted to protect her from the consequences of being kind in a place that treated kindness like a weakness. Instead, she simply said, "Be careful," and let the words carry multiple meanings. They worked in the library next, where the quiet was thick and smelled faintly of old paper and wood polish. The maid adjusted a stack of books and watched Sophia dust the lower shelves, her movements hesitant but earnest. Sophia's nervousness wasn't just about the work. It was about being watched, about making a mistake that would become a label. The maid recognized that fear because she lived inside it. Watching Sophia made her realize how quickly the mansion trained people into smaller versions of themselves. The house didn't need chains. It used expectations, the constant awareness of being evaluated by someone whose approval controlled your rent. Elena appeared in the library doorway without announcing herself, clipboard tucked beneath her arm. Her gaze traveled over the room, not admiring the order but searching for flaws. When her eyes landed on Sophia, they softened slightly, not warmth, but recognition. Elena valued compliance, and Sophia radiated it. Then Elena's gaze slid to the maid, sharpening again, as if suspicion required constant maintenance to stay alive. "Check the baseboards," Elena said, her voice low. "The dust settles there. And make sure the silver tray in the hallway is polished. It looked dull yesterday." The maid nodded. Sophia nodded too, quickly, as if trying to prove she was listening. Elena paused, then added, "And no personal phone use. Not even for a minute. If you need something, you speak to me." The maid felt the words land like a tight collar. The rule was framed as professional, but it was aimed at her humanity. She kept her face composed. "Understood," she said. Elena watched her for a moment longer than necessary. In that look was a story of her own years of keeping her head down, learning that in a hierarchy there was safety in being the one who enforced rules instead of the one who broke them. The maid sensed that Elena had once been watched the same way, measured and doubted, and had chosen the only defense the house respected, becoming stricter than the people above her required. There was tragedy in it, quiet and practical. Elena had traded softness for stability, and stability had rewarded her. After Elena left, Sophia exhaled softly, as if she had been holding her breath. "She's always like that," Sophia whispered, almost apologetic. The maid wiped the shelf edge slowly, letting the repetitive motion settle her thoughts. "She's trying to keep her job," she said. "Like all of us." Sophia hesitated. "But you're not like her," she said, with a certainty that made the maid flinch. "Not like her." The words sounded like praise, but they also sounded like pressure. The maid didn't want to be a symbol for Sophia, and she didn't want Sophia to learn that surviving meant becoming hard. Yet she also understood Elena's choices more than she wanted to admit. Rules had saved Elena from being replaceable. If you became indispensable to the system spared you. It didn't mean it respected you. It meant you were useful. Later that afternoon, the house's social world brushed against the staff's hidden one in a way that always felt like a collision. A family associate, someone who came and went with the ease of belonging, arrived unexpectedly, the kind of person who treated the mansion like a private extension of their own life. He moved through the entryway with a phone pressed to his ear, laughing softly at something only he found amusing. His shoes were spotless. His coat draped over one arm as if gravity was optional. He didn't greet anyone. He didn't need to. His attention passed over staff the way it passed over furniture, useful, present, not worth naming. The maid and Sophia were near the foyer, adjusting a vase arrangement. The associate walked straight toward them and, without breaking his call, held out his coat in the maid's direction. Not a request, not eye contact, just the expectation that her arms existed to take what he no longer wanted to hold. The maid's hands paused, then moved automatically, receiving the coat with careful respect because the fabric looked expensive enough to be fragile. The associate continued speaking into his phone. As he passed, his shoulder brushed the vase table, and the arrangement shifted slightly. One stem leaned, threatening to topple the balance. Sophia reacted instinctively, reaching out to steady it. Her fingers bumped a small decorative object beside the vase, and it slid with a soft scrape. The associate stopped mid-step, still holding his phone, and looked back with an expression of irritation that didn't match the tiny sound. "Do you people have any idea how much these things cost?" he said, voice still controlled, but sharp enough to make the air feel colder. Sophia froze, eyes wide. The maid felt a familiar heat rise in her chest. The object hadn't even fallen. Nothing was broken. Yet the associate's tone carried the deeper message. Staff were clumsy by nature, liabilities by default. "It's fine," the maid said quietly, setting the coat over her arm and adjusting the decorative piece back into place. Nothing happened. The associate's gaze landed on her, and for a moment she saw the calculation there, the way he decided what she was worth without knowing her name. "Just be careful," he said, and the words sounded like a warning issued to an object, not a person. Then he turned away, resuming his call as if the interruption had been inconvenient. Sophia's face had gone pale. When the associate disappeared down the hall, she whispered, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean." The maid shook her head slightly. "You were trying to help," she said. "That's not a crime." But in the mansion's moral logic, help from staff could still be punished if it disturbed the illusion of effortless luxury. The maid felt something settle inside her as she watched Sophia's hands tremble while she straightened the flowers. Sophia was learning the lesson Elena had learned long ago. Minimize yourself because even your reflexes could offend someone. As the day went on, the maid found herself watching Elena with new eyes. Elena's strictness wasn't only cruelty, it was strategy. She watched Sophia too and saw the opposite strategy. Softness, admiration, the hope that kindness could earn safety. And then she watched the associate and saw the strategy of the powerful. Treat others as disposable so you never have to consider their inner lives. That evening, as she returned supplies to the closet and wiped down handles until they shone, she wondered which strategy she was becoming. She had been silent to survive, careful to avoid conflict, composed to avoid being misread. She could feel the risk of hardening, of becoming like Elena in the name of stability. She could also feel the danger of remaining too tender, too open like Sophia, in a place that treated tenderness like weakness. The thought sat with her as she walked out into the cooling air. She didn't have to decide who she would be all at once, she told herself, but she needed to notice the slow shaping happening inside her. In a house built on inequality, you didn't just clean rooms. You negotiated your own soul one quiet choice at a time. The mansion held midweek differently than it held mornings. By Wednesday, the air seemed to have absorbed the patterns of everyone inside it. Elena's measured footsteps, Sophia's quiet eagerness, the family's careless passing through rooms that reset themselves. Even the light felt disciplined, softened by thick curtains and glass that filtered the outside world into something decorative. The maid moved through that controlled atmosphere with a caution that had become second nature. Yet lately the caution had sharpened into something more tiring. It wasn't only the work. It was the sense of being interpreted constantly, reduced to whatever story made the house feel orderly. She was in the service pantry near the study wing when Elena found her, clipboard pressed to her side like an extension of her authority. Elena's face was calm, but the calm carried urgency, the kind that meant the message did not belong to Elena alone. "He wants to see you," Elena said, and paused long enough for the words to settle. "In the study. Now." The maid's fingers tightened around the stack of neatly folded cloths in her hands. She didn't ask who, because there was only one he in the mansion that required no clarification. For a moment she felt the reflex to defend herself rise, even though she didn't know what she was defending against. The watch had never been found, and suspicion had become less loud but more embedded, like a stain the house refused to admit it had. She nodded once, carefully, and followed Elena down the corridor where the carpets grew thicker and the doorframes looked heavier. the architecture itself suggesting that decisions were made here and felt elsewhere. The study door was open just enough to reveal the warm glow of lamps against dark wood. The room smelled faintly of leather and cedar, a scent that made wealth feel like something physical, something that could be inhaled. The maid stepped inside with her hands folded in front of her apron, posture straight, eyes lowered until she was near enough to be addressed. Elena stayed at the threshold, not entering fully, as if her role was to deliver and witness, not to participate. The billionaire stood by the desk, not seated, not relaxed. He wore a simple shirt with sleeves rolled back, the kind of casual that still looked intentional. Papers were spread neatly in front of him, and a laptop sat open, its screen reflecting a pale rectangle of light onto his face. He looked up as she entered, and his gaze carried the same managerial neutrality she had seen before, an attention that measured rather than understood. "Close the door," he said, not unkindly, but with the quiet expectation of obedience. Elena eased it shut from the outside, leaving the maid alone with him and the heavy silence of his private space. He gestured toward a chair across from his desk, and she sat because refusing would be interpreted as defiance. The chair was upholstered, firm, designed for guests who belonged. Sitting in it, she felt the strange contradiction of being invited into comfort while still being treated as disposable. She kept her hands in her lap, fingers interlaced to stop them from trembling. "I'm going to be direct," he said. His voice was calm, the tone of someone who believed calm equaled fairness. "There's been tension among staff, accusations, rumors, missing property." He paused, watching her face as if expecting it to reveal something useful. "That's not acceptable in my house." The maid breathed slowly through her nose, careful not to look defensive. She had learned that innocence didn't always sound innocent. "I understand," she said. He nodded as if she had confirmed what he already believed. "I'm not interested in drama," he continued. "I'm interested in solutions. Elena tells me you've been involved in the atmosphere." The word involved was a soft substitute for suspected, and the maid felt its weight. "I don't know if you took anything. I don't know if you didn't. But the situation is affecting operations." The maid's throat tightened. She stared at the edge of the desk, noticing how perfectly the wood grain flowed, how the surface held no clutter. She wanted to lift her eyes and insist on her dignity, to say she was not an atmosphere. She was a person. She forced herself to speak evenly. "I didn't take anything," she said. "I've never taken anything." He listened, but his expression didn't change in a way that suggested belief. It changed in a way that suggested he had filed her statement into a category labeled expected denial. "Fine," he said, and the word was not agreement. It was a decision to move past the question without resolving it. He reached into a drawer and pulled out an envelope, thick and plain. He placed it on the desk between them with a controlled motion, like setting down a paperweight. "This is a bonus," he said. "A month's pay. Consider it compensation for the discomfort you've experienced." The maid blinked, surprised despite herself. The envelope sat there like an object with its own gravity. A month's pay could cover rent, could pay for her mother's medication, could relieve the constant pressure that lived behind her ribs. She felt her body react before her mind did. A small surge of hope quickly followed by suspicion. Gifts in a place like this were never pure. They were solutions that bought silence. He continued, as if explaining a reasonable transaction. "I don't want this to become bigger than it is. Money is a clean way to settle a mess. You take the bonus, we reset expectations, and everyone moves forward." The maid's fingers tightened in her lap until her knuckles ached. She understood with sudden clarity what his blind spot was. He believed fairness could be paid. He believed harm could be neutralized by compensation. He believed that if he offered money, he was offering justice, because in his world money had always repaired what it touched. But what she had lost in the last days wasn't just comfort. It was her reputation. It was the right to exist in that house without being watched. It was the simple dignity of being believed when she spoke. She looked at the envelope, then slowly lifted her eyes to him. Her voice came out quieter than she expected, steady but carrying restraint. "Sir," she said, "I need my job. I need to be paid for my work. But I don't need this." His brows drew together slightly, the first sign of genuine surprise. "Why not?" he asked, as if the refusal was irrational. "It's not charity. It's a practical gesture." The maid swallowed, feeling her heartbeat in her throat. She had never spoken this directly to someone like him. Directness had consequences. Yet she felt something in her, something she had been protecting for too long, insist on being named. "Because it won't change what people think," she said. "It won't change how they look at me. If I take it, it will look like you're paying me to disappear. Or paying me because I did something wrong." His mouth tightened, not in anger, but in the discomfort of encountering a problem money didn't immediately solve. "You're reading too much into it," he said, and the words revealed how unfamiliar he was with being on the powerless side of interpretation. "People will move on." The maid's gaze held his for a moment longer than was safe. "People move on when they're allowed to," she replied. "Staff don't get to move on. We get remembered." Silence settled between them, thick and unusual. The billionaire looked at her as if he were seeing a new variable he hadn't calculated for. She could almost watch the distance in his mind, the way he tried to translate her words into something manageable. For him, staff were systems. Tasks completed, standards maintained, problems corrected. For her, the house was not a system. It was a daily negotiation of dignity. He leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose. "What do you want, then?" he asked. The question sounded sincere, but also impatient, as if he had offered the obvious solution and now needed her to choose a replacement quickly. The maid hesitated because wanting something in a place like this felt dangerous. Wanting sounded like entitlement. Yet she answered because the alternative was letting his assumptions define the outcome. "I want to do my job," she said, "and I want the same rules applied to everyone. If there's proof, you can fire me. If there isn't, then I shouldn't be treated like I'm guilty." His eyes narrowed slightly, not hostile, but focused. "Rules are applied," he said, and in that sentence was the privilege of believing a system is fair because it claims to be. He had never had to prove his innocence in someone else's hallway. The maid shook her head once, small and controlled. "No," she said, "not the same. When someone upstairs loses something, staff become suspects automatically. When staff are treated badly, it becomes how the house runs." The billionaire's jaw tightened, then relaxed. He looked down at the envelope, tapping it once as if trying to return to the language he trusted. "You realize I can end this by replacing people," he said calmly. "I can hire new staff. I can change procedures. I can make it stop." The maid felt a chill move through her, because he wasn't threatening her with anger. He was threatening her with the quiet power of replacement, the kind that didn't need cruelty to be devastating. She kept her posture still. "You can," she agreed. "That's the difference." Her answer seemed to land somewhere deeper than the conversation itself. For a moment he looked genuinely tired, as if the mansion's problems were irritating precisely because they were human. He didn't apologize. He didn't soften. But his gaze shifted, less certain, less sealed behind the idea that authority equaled fairness. He slid the envelope a fraction closer to her, then stopped, as if reconsidering. "Keep working," he said finally. "Do your job. I'll speak to Elena. I'll remind everyone of protocol again. No gossip. No accusations without proof." It was still a managerial solution. It still centered the system. Yet it was not nothing. The maid nodded, not grateful, not defiant, simply acknowledging the reality of his control. She stood, smoothing her apron, and felt the strange mixture of pride and fear in her chest. Pride because she had refused to be bought into silence. Fear because she didn't know what refusing meant in a world where he could rewrite her life with a signature. When she left the study, the corridor felt colder than before. Elena waited outside, face unreadable. The maid walked past her without speaking, because speaking would invite questions she couldn't safely answer. She returned to her tasks, hands moving steadily, wiping surfaces that would shine no matter how she felt. Yet inside, something had shifted. She had seen the billionaire's blind spot up close, the belief that fairness was automatic if you had money to enforce it, and she had named her own truth anyway. By the end of the day, the mansion looked flawless again, lamps glowing softly, floors reflecting light in perfect lines. The maid hung up her apron and washed her hands, watching the water run clear over her fingers. She could still feel the envelope's weight in her mind, the unspoken offer to accept comfort in exchange for silence. She left the house with her shoulders squared, not because she felt safe, but because she had preserved something small and essential. In a place where dignity was traded for convenience, she had chosen, for one quiet hour, not to sell hers. The offer arrived the morning after she left the study with her dignity intact and her nerves quietly frayed. The mansion looked unchanged, floors reflecting light like still water, floral arrangements posed as if they had never wilted, the air carrying that familiar mix of citrus cleaner and expensive perfume that seemed to cling to the walls. Yet she felt the difference in herself. She moved with the same discipline, but her attention no longer floated outside her body the way it used to. Something in her had hardened into awareness. She had seen how quickly a problem could be solved without being understood, and how easily her life could be reshaped by a decision made behind a door she didn't have a key for. Elena called her into the small side office near the service corridor, the one that smelled faintly of paper and starch, where reprimands were usually delivered in calm sentences. The maid wiped her palms against her apron before stepping inside, a reflex she couldn't control. Elena sat behind the desk with her clipboard and a pen that always seemed ready to mark someone down. Her face held the practiced neutrality of a woman who had learned that emotion was dangerous in a hierarchy. But there was something else too. A slight stiffness, the kind that suggested she had received instructions she didn't fully agree with and was determined to execute them anyway. Elena didn't waste time on softness. "There's a change," she said. "A new assignment." The maid kept her expression steady, though her stomach tightened. In the mansion, change rarely meant improvement. It meant new scrutiny, new expectations, new ways to fail. "What kind of assignment?" she asked quietly. Elena's eyes flicked toward the door as if ensuring it was closed. "You'll be moved closer to the private wing," she said, voice lowered. "Not full-time, but you'll assist there more often. The pay will increase." For a moment the words didn't settle. Private wing, increased pay. Her first reaction was not joy but suspicion, because opportunities in that house didn't arrive like gifts. They arrived like adjustments, calculated and strategic, meant to correct something for the people who mattered. She thought of the missing watch that still hadn't been found, the rumors that still clung to her like invisible lint. She thought of the envelope on the billionaire's desk and the way he had called money a clean solution. An increased pay rate sounded like another clean solution, another attempt to smooth tension without acknowledging its source. "Why me?" she asked, and immediately regretted the question. Asking why was a kind of audacity. Elena's mouth tightened. "Because you're capable," she said, then added as if forced to include the rest. "And because he requested it. He wants less noise. Less conflict. Less conflict." The maid heard what Elena didn't say. He wanted control. He wanted predictability. And perhaps, in his mind, placing her closer to the private wing would either elevate her into silence or expose her to enough scrutiny that the rumors would either die or be confirmed. The thought made her throat go dry. Elena slid a paper across the desk. It wasn't a contract, not formal enough for that, but it was written clearly. New responsibilities, new hours on certain days, a pay increase that looked significant enough to make her heart jump despite her caution. She stared at the numbers. They were the kind of numbers that meant breathing room. They meant her mother's medication could be purchased without a week of quiet panic. They meant rent could be paid without calculating coins at the kitchen table. They meant she could stop counting every small expense as if it were a moral failure. Her body wanted to accept immediately. Her mind resisted. The private wing meant proximity to the billionaire's routines, his family's private life, his guests, his papers left on desks, his clothing folded in drawers that smelled of cologne and expensive fabric. The closer you were to wealth, the more you were blamed for anything that shifted out of place. It was also where boundaries became blurrier, where staff were expected to be not just efficient but discreet in a way that sometimes meant swallowing discomfort without complaint. Extra pay could be compensation for extra silence. "What exactly would I be doing?" she asked, voice even. Elena tapped the paper with her pen. "Laundry coordination for that wing. Light cleaning. Preparing the sitting area before meetings. Sometimes serving coffee if he's working late. It's not complicated. It's about trust." The word trust landed like a quiet insult. Trust was what they demanded from her while refusing to offer it back. She looked up at Elena, studying her face. Elena had survived by enforcing rules. Perhaps she believed this was a reward, a chance to be closer to the center and therefore harder to discard. Or perhaps she saw it as a risk and wanted to see how the maid would handle it. The maid couldn't tell. In that house, people rarely revealed their true motives. Motives were vulnerabilities. Sophia was waiting in the corridor when she stepped out of the office, as if she had been sent away and then returned at the first safe moment. The younger girl's eyes widened with concern. "Are you okay?" she whispered. The maid nodded, but her expression must have betrayed her because Sophia leaned closer. "Did she say something about the watch again?" The maid hesitated, then shook her head. "No," she said softly. "It's something else." Sophia's gaze dropped to the paper in the maid's hand, and understanding sparked. "A change?" she asked, almost breathless. "Is it good?" The maid didn't know how to answer. Good and dangerous were not opposites in the mansion. Sometimes they were the same thing. "It's more pay," she admitted. Sophia's face brightened instantly, the pure, hopeful reaction of someone who still believed effort led to reward. "That's amazing," she said, and then, catching herself, lowered her voice. "You deserve it." The maid felt something twist gently in her chest, part gratitude, part fear. Sophia's admiration was sweet, but it also amplified her visibility. If Sophia celebrated her, others would watch her more closely. If she rose, they would search for reasons to pull her back down. The maid squeezed Sophia's arm lightly, a small gesture meant to quiet the excitement. "Don't talk about it," she murmured. "Not yet." The rest of the day unfolded under a thin film of unreality. She moved through tasks with her thoughts split between the paper folded in her pocket and the weight of what it represented. In the hallway mirrors, she caught glimpses of herself and tried to read her own face. Was she the kind of person who accepted a risky offer because she needed stability? Or was she becoming someone who could be bought into quiet compliance? She remembered the envelope on the billionaire's desk, the clean way he had tried to settle discomfort with money. This offer was not the same, but it rhymed with the same logic. If you adjust the employee's circumstances, the employee will stop being inconvenient. Later, she carried fresh linens toward the stair landing and saw the family associate again, the one who had treated Sophia like a clumsy interruption. He stood in the foyer speaking with someone, laughing lightly. When he noticed the maid, his gaze flicked over her as if recognizing her role rather than her person. "Ah," he said, voice smooth. "The staff rearrangement is happening already." The maid's steps slowed. She hadn't realized people outside the staff structure knew. The associate's smile held a polite edge, the kind that enjoyed being informed. "You're moving up," he added, as if her life were an entertaining detail. "Be careful. The closer you get, the sharper the knives." He said it lightly, but the maid felt the message beneath it. In this house, proximity didn't mean belonging. It meant being watched. She lowered her gaze and continued walking, carrying the linens like something fragile. That evening, Elena called her again, briefly, to confirm she would start the new assignment the next day. The maid nodded and said yes, because saying no felt impossible. Yet on her way out, as she passed the closed doors of the private wing corridor, she paused for a heartbeat. The carpet underfoot muffled sound. The air cooler here, the lighting softer in a way that suggested privacy was protected like wealth itself. She imagined herself entering those rooms, folding shirts that cost more than her monthly rent, serving coffee to meetings that decided things she would never be consulted about. She imagined the rumors that could grow from being seen there. Favoritism, payment for silence, new accusations if anything went missing again. She imagined her mother's face when she could finally say, "We're okay this month," and felt the ache of needing stability so badly it could be used to steer her. In the staff corridor, she unfolded the paper one more time and studied it under the harsh fluorescent light. The numbers looked real. The risk felt real too. She pressed the paper back into her pocket and breathed slowly until her heartbeat softened. Consent, she realized, was not always a clear yes or no. Sometimes it was a narrow path you walked because the alternative was falling. But she also understood something else, quieter and steadier. If she accepted, she would have to set her own boundaries internally, because no one else in that house would protect them for her. When she finally stepped outside into the night air, the city smelled honest. Car exhaust, street food, damp pavement. She walked toward the bus stop with her shoulders squared, not with excitement, but with cautious resolve. The offer could change her stability, and she needed stability. But she would not let the house decide what that stability cost her. She held that thought close, like a small piece of warmth she could carry into tomorrow without letting anyone see it. Her first day on the private wing rotation began with a kind of quiet that felt manufactured. The corridor carpeting swallowed her steps so completely that she became afraid of her own breathing, as if even air moved differently here. The doors were heavier, the handles colder, the lighting softer, and the air carried a faint mix of cedar and something sharper. An expensive cologne that lingered in fabric and wood as if the house had absorbed its owner's presence. She held her supplies close to her body, not because she needed both hands, but because the gesture made her feel smaller, more contained, less likely to be accused of taking up space. Elena met her at the entrance to the wing with a clipboard and a look that was professionally blank. "You follow the list exactly," she said, holding out a laminated sheet. "No improvising. If you find personal items, you call me. You don't move them. You don't touch them." The maid nodded, swallowing the bitter taste of being reminded of a watch she had never seen. "Understood," she said, voice steady. Elena's eyes didn't soften. "And you won't be alone," she added. The words were delivered as if they were for the maid's benefit, but the maid heard what they meant. Supervision. "Sophia will assist. She'll report directly to me." Sophia appeared behind Elena, hands clasped in front of her apron, eyes nervous but determined. She offered the maid a small, supportive glance that was meant to be comforting. The maid appreciated it, yet she also felt the weight of the arrangement. Sophia's presence would make the work easier, but it would also make every movement witnessed, every mistake shared, every rumor easier to build. Trust in this house was never simply between two people. It was filtered through whoever held the authority to believe or dismiss. The tasks were not hard. Not in the way scrubbing a kitchen floor until your knees burned was hard. They were hard in a different way, hard because everything here looked untouchable, because the objects weren't just objects, they were symbols. She folded shirts that felt like soft water between her fingers and placed them in drawers lined with cedar blocks. She wiped a desk that held framed photos and a paperweight heavy enough to look like it had never been moved by impatience. She straightened a sitting area where the pillows were arranged like quiet commands. Perfect, aligned, unwrinkled, as if comfort were allowed only in curated form. Sophia moved carefully beside her, almost reverently, dusting a shelf with a trembling focus. "You're doing fine," the maid murmured once, because she could see fear in Sophia's shoulders. "Just slow down." Sophia nodded quickly. "I'm trying," she whispered, as if effort alone could protect her. In the late morning, a small disruption occurred. Nothing dramatic, nothing that should have mattered. The maid was preparing the sitting area outside the study, wiping fingerprints from a glass side table. Sophia had stepped into the adjoining kitchenette to refill the water tray. The maid heard footsteps approaching, measured, confident, and her body tensed automatically. The billionaire passed through briefly, speaking into his phone, not looking at her at first. She lowered her gaze and shifted slightly aside, making space the way the house taught her to. His call ended, and he paused long enough to glance at the table she had cleaned. His eyes flicked over the space, the way he always assessed things, as if order was something he owned. "Elena told me you started the new rotation," he said. His tone was neither friendly nor hostile. It was managerial, the voice of someone checking a project's progress. "Yes, sir," she replied. He nodded once. "Good. Keep it professional. No distractions." His gaze lingered for a fraction of a second, then moved on, already turning away as if his attention had been spent. It was not an insult. It was worse in its own quiet way, the reminder that professionalism, in his mind, included emotional invisibility. She watched him walk away and felt the familiar pressure in her chest. Being close enough to be used, never close enough to be considered. Around noon, Elena appeared again, accompanied by a family member the maid had seen only in passing. A woman with a sharp elegance that seemed designed to make other people feel unfinished. The woman's presence changed the air. Staff straightened instinctively, like plants turning away from harsh light. Elena introduced her in a low tone, but the maid barely caught the name. It didn't matter. The woman belonged to the tier of people whose identity was assumed. The woman's eyes moved across the sitting area and then landed on the maid. Her gaze was not openly cruel. It was the gaze of someone evaluating a tool for reliability. "So this is the one," she said, voice smooth with the ease of someone used to speaking without being questioned. Elena's posture remained rigid. "Yes," she replied. "She's assisting in this wing now." The woman's mouth curved slightly. "Interesting choice," she said. The word choice made the maid feel like a decision made on paper. After the incident, the maid's stomach tightened. She kept her face neutral, hands still. Sophia had returned from the kitchenette and stood slightly behind her, eyes lowered, as if trying to disappear. The woman stepped closer, her perfume sharp and clean. "We have guests coming this weekend," she said, not to the maid directly, but to Elena, as if the maid's presence didn't qualify her for direct conversation. "Important people, investors, press adjacent. There can't be any more stories floating around the staff." Elena nodded quickly. "Of course." The woman's gaze finally addressed the maid, and the maid felt her skin prickle under it. "You understand how things look," the woman said. "People talk. We can't afford loose ends." The maid swallowed. "I understand," she said, because any other answer would be taken as resistance. After they left, the maid returned to folding and wiping with a steadiness that felt forced. The house was not just watching her. It was preparing to use her as a symbol. If the family needed reassurance for guests, staff would be adjusted like furniture until the right image appeared. The maid had seen it before in smaller ways, warnings about phone calls, reminders about silence. Now it felt larger, more official. The real sabotage arrived quietly, disguised as a small mistake. In the afternoon, Elena asked her to bring a set of polished silver coasters to the sitting area outside the study. The maid had handled that set before. It was kept in a particular drawer in the service kitchenette. She opened the drawer and found the coasters already inside a cloth pouch, as if someone had prepared them for her. She assumed Elena had placed them there earlier. She didn't question it, because questioning every detail would make her look paranoid, and paranoia would be interpreted as guilt. She carried the pouch to the sitting area and began placing the coasters neatly on the table. As she opened the cloth, a small object slipped out and clinked against the glass. A cufflink, silver, shaped with an understated design. Her breath caught. For a heartbeat she froze, the room narrowing to the tiny object resting on the table like an accusation made solid. She didn't touch it. She didn't even blink. She stared at it with the feeling of being trapped in someone else's story. Sophia stepped closer, eyes widening. "What is that?" she whispered, panic rising. The maid's pulse hammered. "I don't know," she said carefully. "It wasn't mine. I didn't." Elena's footsteps arrived at the doorway, sharp and purposeful, as if summoned by the sound. She stopped when she saw the cufflink. Her face didn't show surprise. It showed confirmation. "What is this?" Elena asked, voice flat. The maid kept her hands visible, empty. "It fell out of the pouch," she said. "The coasters were in there. I didn't put it." Elena stepped forward and picked up the cufflink with the edge of a cloth, not her bare fingers, as if protecting herself from contamination. "Where did you get this pouch?" she demanded. "The kitchenette drawer," the maid replied. "Like you told me." Elena's eyes narrowed. "That drawer is checked every morning," she said, and the statement carried an accusation. "You must be lying because our system is perfect." Sophia's voice trembled. "Elena, I saw her open it. It was all ready." Elena silenced her with a look. Then she turned back to the maid. "This is exactly why procedures exist," she said. "You're not to touch personal items." "I didn't touch it," the maid insisted, her control slipping just enough to reveal desperation. "It fell out. I stopped." Elena's jaw tightened. "Come with me," she said. In the side office, Elena produced a formal sheet, clean paper, official letterhead, and placed it on the desk. The maid recognized the shape of a written warning immediately, the kind that lived in personnel files and quietly decided futures. Elena's pen hovered above the signature line like a blade held politely. "This is a warning for mishandling personal property and violating protocol," she said. "One more incident and you're terminated." The maid stared at the paper, feeling her chest constrict. "I didn't violate anything," she said. "Someone put that in the pouch." Elena's eyes flickered just once, with something that could have been doubt or could have been annoyance at complication. "You have no proof," she replied. "And we have optics to protect." Optics. The word made the maid feel suddenly nauseated, because it admitted the truth without admitting it. Reality mattered less than appearance. Proof mattered less than comfort for the powerful. The billionaire was brought into it later that day, not by the maid's request but by the escalating need to make a decision before the weekend guests arrived. She was called again to the study, the same room where he had tried to pay for resolution. This time Elena stood inside with her clipboard, and the family associate hovered near the doorway, the same man who had warned her about knives. The billionaire listened to Elena summarize the situation in clean phrases. Protocol breached, item found in staff handling, risk to trust, upcoming guests. The maid stood straight, hands clasped, refusing to look guilty. "I did not take anything," she said when allowed to speak. "The cufflink was placed in the pouch before I opened it. Someone is setting me up." The billionaire's face tightened in the familiar way it did when human truth complicated management. He looked at Elena, then at the associate, then back at the maid. "We can't run a household on suspicions," he said finally. "We run it on procedures." The maid felt a sharp heat behind her eyes. "Exactly," she replied, voice controlled but strained. "And procedures can be used against the wrong person." He exhaled slowly, the sound of someone deciding what costs less. "You'll be removed from the private wing rotation," he said. "Effective immediately. You'll return to general duties under supervision. Elena will document this warning." The decision was framed as neutral. It was not firing. It was not condemnation. It was simply safe. Yet the maid felt the punishment in it. Her pay stability threatened, her reputation further stained, her progress erased. Neutrality, she realized, was the luxury of people who could afford the consequences not landing on them. She watched his eyes shift after he spoke, a brief flicker of something like realization when he saw her face. Controlled, proud, hurt without theatrics. He had meant to protect the house. Instead, he had protected the comfort of those who already held power. His neutral choice had chosen a side. He didn't call her back. He didn't correct the paper. The machinery of the mansion moved on. The maid left the study with her head high because lowering it would feel like surrender. Back in the staff corridor, she went to the sink and washed her hands slowly, as if the water could rinse off accusation. Sophia found her there and hovered, eyes glossy with frustration. "I'm sorry," Sophia whispered. "I tried." The maid nodded once, swallowing the tightness in her throat. "I know," she said, and meant it. She didn't have the energy to comfort Sophia fully, but she didn't want Sophia to learn that trying was useless. When she stepped outside at the end of the day, the evening air felt colder than it should have. She walked toward the bus stop with the written warning's weight still pressing in her mind, heavier than paper. She had lost the private wing pay increase and gained a file that could follow her anywhere. Yet beneath the exhaustion, something steadier remained. She had not begged. She had not accepted blame to make things easier. The house could rewrite procedures to protect itself, but she would not rewrite her own memory to match their comfort. She held that truth close as she rode home, letting it settle into her bones like a quiet, stubborn form of dignity that no policy could erase. The written warning sat in Elena's office like a small, quiet weapon. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no slammed doors. Just a page in a file with her name typed cleanly at the top, as if that alone was enough to narrow her entire life into a single accusation. The maid returned to general duties under supervision, and the mansion resumed its polished rhythm with the ease of a place that could absorb human discomfort without ever changing its face. The private wing pay increase disappeared as if it had never existed. The air around her changed again, but this time it wasn't active suspicion as much as careful distance. A decision made by everyone at once to avoid standing too close to a person labeled risk. She moved through her tasks as she always had, quiet, precise, steady. But the steadiness felt heavier now, less like habit and more like restraint. Every time she opened a drawer, she kept her hands visible. Every time she carried a tray, she held it slightly away from her body so no one could imagine she was hiding something beneath it. She hated that she had started performing her innocence, hated that part of her mind had begun to anticipate how others might misread her. Yet she also understood it was survival. In a house built on appearances, innocence needed choreography. Sophia, assigned to report to Elena, still found ways to hover near her when possible. The younger girl's kindness had become quieter, more cautious, as if she had learned that loyalty could cost. When Sophia passed her in the linen room, she offered a small nod, the kind that carried apology and admiration at once. The maid returned it without lingering because lingering created stories. Still, the maid felt a faint warmth at the gesture. In a place where people avoided eye contact to protect themselves, even a nod felt like someone admitting you were real. The proof arrived in fragments, the way truth often did in the mansion, through the cracks of routine, not through grand revelations. It began with a detail the maid had noticed the day of the cufflink but hadn't named aloud. The pouch in the kitchenette drawer had looked newly folded, the cloth too crisp, the knot too deliberate. It had felt prepared. She remembered the drawer's smell of metal and lemon cleaner, the way the coasters usually lay flat, not bundled. That memory had stayed with her like a splinter. It didn't prove anything, but it refused to leave her mind. A few days after the warning, she was assigned to clean a small storage corridor near the pantry, one of the in-between spaces where the mansion stored its extras. Replacement glassware, seasonal linens, spare decor. The corridor was narrow and unglamorous, a reminder that even luxury required clutter somewhere. As she wiped shelves and restacked boxes, she overheard voices around the corner. Two staff members speaking quickly, low enough to believe they were unheard. She paused, not out of curiosity, but because one of the voices carried a nervous edge she recognized. It was the junior cleaner who had hovered during the missing watch accusation, the one who always looked like she was trying not to be seen. "I didn't mean for it to get that far," the girl whispered. I thought it would be one small thing." Elena said we needed to show control before the weekend. Another voice, older and sharper, responded with impatience. "Control is control. Don't start trembling now." The maid's breath tightened. She stepped back instinctively, heart pounding. Her mind raced through the shape of the words, the implication. One small thing. Show control. The mansion's problems had never been truly about objects. They had been about managing people. She felt her hands go cold as she realized she might not have been misread by accident. She might have been used. She didn't rush out. She didn't confront them in the corridor. The house punished theatrics. Instead, she returned to her cleaning with deliberate calm, as if her hands belonged to someone else. But inside her chest, something sharpened into clarity. If someone had planted the cufflink to justify policy, then the warning wasn't only unfair. It was manufactured. And manufactured injustice was harder to fight because it wore the mask of procedure. That evening, She waited until she could catch Sophia in a neutral space, near the laundry room where noise from machines offered cover. Sophia looked tired, her eyes shadowed with the kind of exhaustion that came from being pulled between obedience and conscience. The maid approached quietly and spoke in a low voice that didn't invite drama. "Sophia," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest." Sophia's face tightened. "What is it?" The maid steadied herself. "The day of the cufflink," she said. "Did you see anyone in the kitchenette before me? Anyone near that drawer?" Sophia hesitated, her gaze flicking toward the corridor as if Elena might appear out of the walls. "I don't know," she whispered, but the words came out too quickly. The maid watched her carefully, not accusing, not pleading. "I'm not asking you to guess," she said. "I'm asking if you remember." Sophia's breathing changed, shallow and uneven. Her fingers twisted the edge of her apron. "I saw someone," she admitted finally. "Not inside the kitchenette, but near it. The junior cleaner, Marisol. She was carrying a cloth pouch. I thought it was just supplies." The maid's stomach dropped, not in surprise but in confirmation. "Did you tell Elena?" she asked softly. Sophia's eyes filled, and she blinked hard, ashamed. "I tried," she whispered. When Elena told me to report directly to her, I mentioned Marisol being near the drawer. Elena said I must be mistaken. She said I was new and didn't understand how serious it was to accuse someone. She told me to focus on my work." The maid felt a tight, bitter relief. There it was, the truth trying to surface and being pressed back down by authority. She reached out and touched Sophia's forearm lightly, not comforting her like a child, but anchoring her as a person. "Thank you," she said. "That matters." Sophia swallowed. "I'm scared," she admitted, voice shaking. "If I say it again, Elena will punish me, or move me, or say I'm lying." "I know," the maid replied. The words weren't dramatic. They were heavy with understanding. "But they already punished me, and they'll keep doing it to someone else if we let it stay quiet." Sophia looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing the cost of silence written into the maid's posture. Her admiration shifted into something more difficult, responsibility. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. The maid took a slow breath. "Tell the truth," she said. "To him, not to Elena." Sophia's face drained of color. She didn't need clarification about who him was. The billionaire was not a person staff approached. He was a distance, a boundary. Speaking to him directly was risky in a way that could end employment instantly. Sophia's lips parted as if to refuse, then closed again. The maid could see the battle inside her. The instinct to survive, and the quieter instinct to be decent. The opportunity came the next day in a way that felt almost accidental, though nothing in that mansion ever truly was. The billionaire was walking through the main hallway toward the study wing, alone this time, without guests or advisors. The house seemed to straighten around him, but he moved with the distracted focus of someone carrying many responsibilities. The maid was wiping a console table nearby, and Sophia was sorting linens a few steps behind her. For a moment, it was just the three of them in the corridor, framed by quiet and polished surfaces. The billionaire glanced at the maid briefly, perhaps recognizing her from the meeting, perhaps simply registering staff movement. He started to continue walking. Sophia's breath caught audibly, a small sound of fear. The maid saw her shoulders tense as if she might shrink away, but instead Sophia stepped forward half a pace, trembling and determined. "Sir," Sophia said, voice barely above a whisper. The billionaire stopped. Surprise flickered across his face. Not anger, just the unfamiliarity of being addressed by someone meant to remain invisible. "Yes?" he asked, tone controlled. Sophia swallowed hard. "I need to tell you something," she said. "About the cufflink. About the warning." The maid felt her heart hammer, not because she craved a rescue, but because she understood the cost of what Sophia was doing. Sophia's hands shook at her sides, but she kept going, words tumbling out in careful, honest fragments. She had seen Marisol near the kitchenette with a cloth pouch. The pouch in the drawer looked prepared. she had told Elena. Elena dismissed it, and now the maid had been punished for something that might have been set up to enforce control before important guests. The billionaire's face changed slowly as Sophia spoke. The shift wasn't sudden empathy. It was discomfort, an irritation at realizing his procedures could be used as weapons, and that his neutral decisions had protected the wrong people. He looked at the maid then, really looked not as staff, but as someone who had been carrying humiliation with discipline. The maid held his gaze calmly, refusing to beg, refusing to collapse into emotion to be believed. Elena, he said, voice quieter now, did not report this. Sophia shook her head, eyes wet. She told me not to repeat it, she whispered. The billionaire's jaw tightened. For a moment he seemed caught between two instincts: protect the house's reputation, or confront the truth that reputation had been preserved by sacrificing someone's dignity. He turned slightly toward the maid. "Why didn't you come to me?" he asked, and the question revealed how little he understood about fear from below. The maid answered without bitterness, only with grounded clarity. "Because I did," she said. "And you chose procedure. I didn't think you wanted anything else." The words landed with a quiet force. The billionaire's eyes flickered, a brief sting of recognition. He could afford to believe fairness was automatic because he had never needed to fight for it. He had signed decisions and called them neutral, not realizing neutrality was a luxury that always leaned toward the powerful. He exhaled slowly. "Both of you," he said, "come with me." In the study, the air felt heavier than usual. The billionaire called for Elena, and when she entered, her posture stiffened immediately, sensing that the room's hierarchy had shifted. Sophia stood near the door like a frightened witness. The maid stood with her hands folded, steady and silent. The billionaire asked Elena, directly, whether anyone had reported seeing Marisol near the kitchenette with a pouch. Elena denied it at first, then corrected herself into vaguer language, then retreated behind protocol. The billionaire listened, and the maid watched the familiar pattern. Authority defending itself, truth trying to breathe. This time, though, the billionaire did not accept the smoothness of Elena's explanations. His voice remained calm, but it carried a sharper edge. He instructed Elena to bring the personnel file, to review camera coverage around the kitchenette corridor and supply storage, and to suspend the warning pending investigation. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't apologize in a speech. But the act of pausing punishment was itself an admission that the system had been wrong. When Elena left, face rigid, Sophia's shoulders sagged with relief so intense it looked like exhaustion. The billionaire looked at the maid again, and his gaze held something new. Not warmth, not kindness, but the uneasy awareness of her complexity. He was seeing the person behind the uniform, and it made him uncomfortable because it required accountability. "You shouldn't have been treated like that," he said finally, the closest thing to an apology his pride could manage. The maid nodded once. "Thank you," she replied, not grateful in a simple way, but acknowledging the shift. "Sophia took a risk to tell you." The billionaire glanced toward Sophia, who looked down quickly. "I see that," he said. His expression tightened again, as if he were realizing how much courage it took for staff to do what he considered straightforward. He dismissed them with a quiet instruction to return to work and await updates, the language of management still clinging to him even as the ground beneath his certainty moved. Back in the corridor, Sophia's hands were still trembling, but her eyes held a different light, fear mixed with a fragile pride. The maid walked beside her in silence for a few steps, then spoke softly. "You did the right thing," she said. Sophia swallowed. "I don't know what will happen now," she whispered. "Neither do I," the maid admitted. Then she added with a steadiness that surprised her. "But at least the truth is in the room. That's a debt I couldn't pay alone." As they returned to their tasks, the mansion remained the same on the surface, shining, quiet, controlled. Yet the maid felt something shift beneath that surface. Not resolved, not safe, but real. She had defended herself without begging. A witness had spoken despite fear. And the billionaire had been forced to see that his system could harm people not by accident but by design. The recognition didn't soften him into kindness, but it unsettled his certainty, and for the first time in weeks, the maid felt that her name might not be the easiest story anymore. The next morning, the mansion looked as immaculate as ever, but the air carried a faint shift, like a room after someone has spoken a truth that can't be unheard. The corridors were still quiet, the marble still polished to a mirror shine, yet the staff moved with a different caution, less like they were avoiding the maid and more like they were watching the house itself. She felt it as soon as she stepped into the service corridor. Fewer eyes sliding away, fewer conversations breaking apart when she passed. Not warmth, not acceptance, but a pause in the old certainty that she was the easiest person to blame. Elena's office door stayed closed longer than usual. When Elena finally emerged, her posture was tight, her face controlled to the edge of hardness. She issued instructions the same way she always did, but her authority no longer felt effortless. Felt defended. The maid understood what that meant. Power had been questioned, and questioned power always reacted in small, sharp ways. Still, Elena did not look at her with open hostility. She looked at her with a kind of professional caution, as if the maid had become unpredictable simply by surviving the accusation. Sophia passed her in the linen room and gave her the smallest smile, quickly hidden, as though kindness still had to be smuggled. The maid returned the gesture with a nod that carried gratitude and warning at once. Sophia had spoken up, and even if no one said it aloud, the house had recorded that bravery. The maid didn't want Sophia to pay for it. She didn't want her to learn that integrity always meant punishment. Yet she also knew the lesson was not hers to control. Sophia would learn what the house decided to teach her. Around mid-morning, Elena approached with a clipboard and a statement delivered too evenly. "You've been removed from the written warning," she said, not as an apology but as a report. "It's being revised." Revised. The word sounded like the house trying to correct itself without admitting it had been wrong. The maid nodded and continued folding towels, letting her hands remain steady. She wanted to feel relief, but relief in the mansion always had edges. A file could be revised today and reopened tomorrow. A rumor could soften but never fully disappear. Still, the correction mattered. It meant the truth had weight now, however small. Later, as she wiped the glass doors near the study, she saw the billionaire in the corridor, alone and not moving with the usual sense of hurry. He looked tired in a quiet way, as if something inside his own certainty had become heavier to carry. When he noticed her, he didn't look past her this time. His attention held, and she felt the discomfort in it, the awkwardness of a person realizing that management decisions had landed on a human body. "Can you come in for a minute?" he said, voice low and controlled. It wasn't a request dressed as kindness. It was an instruction with a softer tone. She followed him into the study, the door closing behind them with that familiar hush. The room smelled of leather and cedar again, the scent of decisions. He didn't offer the chair this time, and she didn't sit. Standing felt safer. Standing reminded her that she had legs, that she wasn't kneeling on marble. He moved behind his desk, then stopped as if reconsidering. "I reviewed what happened," he said, "and I spoke to Elena." The maid kept her eyes steady on a point near his shoulder, not challenging, not submissive. "Yes, sir," she replied. His jaw tightened slightly. "The warning will be removed," he said, as if announcing a correction solved the harm. "And I want you compensated for the trouble." She felt the familiar coldness in her stomach at the word compensated. She had heard that language before. It was the language of settlement, of money used to seal a story shut. He reached into the same drawer as before and pulled out another envelope, placing it on the desk. The gesture was almost identical, and the repetition made her chest tighten with something like grief. It was not that she didn't need money. It was that money offered without listening felt like a way of avoiding responsibility. "I'm not asking you to take it as charity," he said, as if anticipating her reaction. "It's an acknowledgement." The maid watched the envelope without reaching for it. She could imagine the rent it could cover, the medication it could pay for, the quiet relief it could buy. She could also imagine how quickly the household would translate it. The owner paid her off, the owner favored her, the owner fixed the problem with cash. In this house, Gifts didn't look like kindness. They looked like leverage. "I appreciate the correction," she said carefully, "but I won't take money to make this disappear." His eyes narrowed, not angrily, but with the friction of being resisted in a way he couldn't dismiss as insolence. "You're still thinking about rumors," he said, a statement that revealed he still didn't fully understand how rumors functioned when you were powerless. "People will move on." She felt heat rise in her throat, but she kept her voice calm. "People move on when it doesn't cost them," she replied. "For staff, reputation is the job. If you pay me, it becomes another story about me instead of what happened." He held her gaze a moment longer, and she saw something shift. Again, not warmth, but a forced awareness. Repair, she realized, made him uncomfortable because it required time, and time required his attention. Money could be written, handed over, closed like a file. Listening was slower. Listening meant he had to sit with the reality that his household ran on fear as much as it ran on schedules. "What would you accept, then?" he asked, quieter. The maid breathed in slowly, choosing her words like stepping stones. "I want the warning removed," she said. "I want Elena to stop treating me like a suspect, and I want you to make it clear that accusations require proof. Not feelings. Not optics." He looked away briefly, the smallest sign of discomfort. "I can issue a policy reminder," he said, already reaching for procedure as shelter. "A reminder isn't enough," she answered, still calm. "Reminders are what happens when the system wants to sound fair but stay the same." Silence thickened. She could hear the faint hum of the building, the quiet machinery that kept everything comfortable for people who never thought about it. The billionaire's hand rested on the desk edge. He looked like a man used to solving visible problems and frustrated by the invisibility of moral ones. "I'll speak to the staff," he said finally. "Directly. No gossip. No accusations without evidence. And if something is found, it goes to Elena immediately. No exceptions." The maid nodded once. It was still imperfect. It was still authority speaking downward. But it was a move from private correction to public accountability, and she knew how rare that was in a house built on appearance. She also knew the speech wouldn't erase what had already been done. Repair was never retroactive. It was only the slow work of changing what happened next. He slid the envelope back into the drawer, the first time she had seen him withdraw money instead of offering it as an answer. "If you have concerns," he said, "you come to Elena." The maid's voice stayed level. "If Elena dismisses me again," she said, "I will come to you." His eyes lifted, and for a moment his expression tightened as if the boundary surprised him. She felt her own heart beat harder, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar feeling of stating a limit aloud. She was not threatening him. She was clarifying the terms of her dignity. He nodded once, stiffly. "Understood," he said. When she left the study, the corridor felt the same and different at once. The house was still the house. It still swallowed footsteps and hid labor behind perfect surfaces. But she walked with a steadier spine, not because she believed the world had changed, but because she had named what she would and would not accept. That naming was a kind of repair too, one she could do for herself even when others moved slowly. The billionaire spoke to the staff that afternoon in the large service area near the kitchen, a place where instructions were usually filtered through Elena's clipboard. Staff gathered in uneasy silence, hands folded, eyes lowered. Elena stood to the side, posture rigid, face carefully blank. The billionaire's presence altered the room immediately. Shoulders straightened, breaths became quieter. He spoke in a controlled, businesslike tone, but he looked more unsettled than usual, as if he didn't enjoy being in the middle of the human consequences of his own household. He reminded everyone about protocol and evidence. He said gossip created harm. He said accusations without proof would not be tolerated. He did not name the maid, and that omission mattered. Naming her would have sealed her as the subject. Not naming her allowed the issue to be about policy, not about one person's humiliation. The maid stood at the edge of the room listening, feeling the small tremor of change ripple through the staff's faces. Some looked relieved, some resentful, some simply wary. power had shifted slightly, and people were adjusting their strategies in real time. Afterward, Sophia approached her with eyes bright and tired. "He really said it?" Sophia whispered, as if needing confirmation that she hadn't imagined it. The maid nodded. "He did," she replied. Sophia's smile trembled. "Does it mean it's over?" The maid looked at the polished floor, at the way light slid across it without catching. "It means it's different," she said. "Not over." That evening, as she folded her apron and washed her hands, she felt a quiet exhaustion that was not only physical. Repair demanded patience. It demanded that she stay steady while others adjusted, while Elena recalculated, while the billionaire learned that accountability couldn't be bought. She walked out into the night air with her shoulders relaxed in a way they hadn't been in weeks. She was still a maid in a mansion that didn't fully see her, but she was also a person who had held her boundaries without shouting, and that was its own kind of strength. The policy reminder changed the mansion's temperature, but it did not change its bones. For a few days, people spoke less in corners. Eyes lifted a second longer before sliding away. The hallways stayed polished, the flowers stayed fresh, and the work stayed endless. But the old certainty that she could be blamed without consequence had cracked. She felt it in small ways. A staff member leaving a door open for her instead of letting it swing shut. A quiet "good morning" that didn't sound forced. Elena's instructions delivered with less theatrical sharpness. None of it was tenderness. It was adjustment, the kind that happens when power shifts just enough to make everyone recalculate. Still, the maid woke each morning with the same knot in her stomach. The written warning had been revised, not erased from memory. The cufflink had been acknowledged as a problem of process, not of malice. Nobody had gathered the staff to say plainly that she had been wronged. In the mansion, harm was corrected the way smudges were corrected. Quietly, efficiently, without naming who made the stain. She understood why. Naming blame threatened the house's illusion of seamless order. But she also understood what it cost. When wrongdoing is corrected without being named, it becomes easier to repeat under a different excuse with a different target. Her home life did not wait for the mansion's moral growth. Her sister's calls came at night, rushed and heavy, carrying updates about their mother's health and the constant arithmetic of survival. The maid sat at her small kitchen table in the dim light of a single bulb, counting what was left after rent and transit, after groceries, after small debts that accumulated like dust in corners. The private wing pay increase had been a brief glimpse of relief. Losing it had made her more aware of how thin her stability really was. She could keep enduring, she told herself. She had endured worse. Yet endurance was not the same as living. There were days she wondered if the mansion was teaching her to accept any kind of treatment as long as it came wrapped in employment. At work, Elena called her into the office again. Not to accuse, but to inform. Elena's face was composed, her hair pinned tight, her posture as controlled as ever. Yet something in her eyes looked tired, as if the week had forced her to carry a weight she didn't know how to name. "Marisol has been reassigned," Elena said, voice neutral. "Lower floor only. No access to private wing supplies." The maid absorbed that quietly. Reassigned was a gentle word. Could mean punishment. Could mean protection. It could mean Elena had made a compromise with the truth without admitting she had resisted it. "And Sophia?" the maid asked, careful. Elena's jaw tightened slightly. "Sophia will remain," she said. "But she'll follow instruction. No more direct approaches to upstairs." The maid felt anger flicker, hot and brief. Even now, the lesson Elena wanted to teach was not integrity but containment. Sophia had done the right thing and was being warned not to do it again. The system always tried to correct the courage out of people. The maid nodded anyway, because open defiance would not protect Sophia. It would only paint another target. Sophia found her later near the laundry room, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "Elena's mad at me," Sophia whispered, as if confessing a sin. The maid folded towels with slow precision, letting the rhythm steady her voice. "Elena is afraid," she said. "Anger is how she hides it." Sophia swallowed. "Marisol won't look at me," she added. "I didn't mean to ruin her life." "You didn't ruin anything," the maid replied softly. Marisol made choices, and you told the truth. Sophia's gaze dropped to her hands. What if I'm next? She whispered. The maid didn't offer false reassurance. She had learned that comfort without reality was another form of disrespect. Then we'll deal with it, she said. But you don't learn safety by lying. That night, the billionaire held a formal dinner. The house tightened around the preparations, staff moving with quick, quiet intensity. Elena became sharper, more alert, because high-profile evenings were where mistakes became visible and visibility became punishment. The associate who had once joked about knives arrived early, smiling too easily, the kind of man who treated reputation like currency. The family member who spoke of optics drifted through the foyer, checking details as if the evening's success could be measured in symmetry. The maid watched all of it from the edges, carrying trays, polishing glass, feeling the subtle contradiction. The household could insist on no gossip, while still relying on whispers to keep staff in line. At one point she was assigned to refresh the powder room near the dining area. She moved quickly, checking towels, wiping the mirror, replacing soap. When she stepped back into the corridor, she nearly collided with the billionaire, who was walking alone, jacket unbuttoned, phone in hand. He paused, and for a moment his face looked strained. Less like authority, more like a man trapped inside his own expectations. You're here tonight, he said, as if confirming a detail. Yes, sir, she replied. He looked past her toward the dining room, where muted laughter drifted behind closed doors. They're watching everything, he said quietly, not to her exactly, but into the space. They always do. The maid heard the truth beneath his words. Family expectations, business relationships, public image. The mansion was not just a home, it was a stage. She could almost feel the pressure on him to appear in control, to appear flawless, to keep the household story clean. She understood that pressure in a different way. She lived under it too, only without the benefit of being admired for carrying it. He glanced back at her. I did what I could, he said, voice low. It sounded like a defense offered before she had accused him. The maid held his gaze steadily. You did what you thought was neutral, she said, calm and precise. And neutral hurt me. His jaw tightened, and he looked away again. For a moment, the distance between their worlds felt smaller. Not because they were equal, but because discomfort had forced him to acknowledge her humanity. I don't like admitting mistakes, he said, almost flatly. The maid didn't soften for him. She also didn't sharpen. Then you'll keep making them, she replied, her voice grounded rather than cruel. Silence held between them, filled with the muffled elegance of the dinner and the unseen labor behind it. He nodded once, stiffly, as if accepting a lesson he didn't want. What would you do? He asked. If you were in my position? The maid felt the question land strangely. It was the first time he had asked her to imagine herself with power rather than simply endure his. She answered carefully. I would want the truth to be cheaper than appearances, she said, because if it isn't, someone always pays. And it's never the person with the most money. His eyes shifted back to her, and for a moment he looked unsettled in a way that had nothing to do with business. He wanted a quick fix. She had given him a moral cost. After he walked away, the maid stood alone in the corridor, breathing slowly. She felt the weight of the choice forming in her chest, the one she had been avoiding because choice was a luxury when rent was due. Staying meant accepting that even improved conditions could change again, that her reputation could be managed but never fully protected, that she would always be one misunderstanding away from losing everything. Leaving meant uncertainty, job searching, the risk of worse employers, the risk of failing her family at the exact moment they needed her most. But leaving also meant reclaiming something she could feel slipping. The belief that she deserved to work without being constantly threatened by someone else's narrative. When her shift ended, she changed out of her uniform in the small staff room, the fluorescent light making everyone look tired. Sophia waited near the lockers, eyes searching her face. Are you okay? Sophia asked. The maid folded her apron slowly. I don't know, she admitted. I'm tired of proving I'm not what they decided I am. Sophia's eyes filled. "If you leave," she whispered, "it will feel like they won." The maid shook her head gently. "If I leave," she said, "it will be because I chose myself. That's not losing." Outside, the night air was cold and honest. She walked toward the bus stop, listening to the city's ordinary sounds. Cars passing, a distant siren, someone laughing on a sidewalk. Her phone buzzed with a message from her sister, short and heavy. Their mother had another appointment scheduled, more tests. The maid stopped beneath a streetlight and read it twice, feeling the familiar squeeze of responsibility. Then she looked up at the dark sky, and she allowed herself a quiet, steady thought. Staying and leaving were both prices, just paid in different currencies. By the time the bus arrived, she had not decided. But she had stopped pretending there was no choice at all. She sat by the window, watching the mansion's neighborhood fade into darker streets, and she felt something settle into place. Not resolution, but readiness. Whatever she chose, she would no longer choose it out of fear alone. The decision didn't arrive like a single brave moment. It arrived quietly, over a few exhausted mornings, in the space between what she needed and what she could no longer tolerate. After the dinner night, she returned to the mansion and found that the air had kept shifting in small, stubborn ways. The house was still the house, polished, private, built to protect certain people from discomfort, but the daily mechanics had changed. Elena's eyes no longer lingered on her hands. Corridor conversations didn't collapse when she passed. Even the senior staff who had once treated her like a risk now treated her like a person who had survived scrutiny and stayed steady. The change was not kindness. It was recalibration, the natural adjustment that happens when power has been forced to look at itself. She realized, with an unexpected sadness, that she had grown used to being afraid. Fear had become a posture, a tightening in her shoulders, a careful way of setting objects down as if she could prevent suspicion by moving gently enough. When that fear began to loosen, she felt the emptiness it had been filling. It was strange to walk the same halls without feeling hunted by implication. It was also painful because loosened fear makes room for memory. The marble cold under her knees, the envelope on the desk, the warning paper sliding across Elena's table like a verdict. The house could revise files, but it could not revise what it had asked her to swallow. The billionaire did not become warm. He did not suddenly understand hardship in the way people who have lived it understand it. But he began to change in a limited, meaningful way, the way someone changes when they finally accept that their neutral choices land on real bodies. It showed in small acts that cost him attention rather than money. Asking Elena, within earshot of staff, to ensure breaks were respected. Thanking the cook one morning without ceremony. Pausing in a hallway to acknowledge a task completed instead of noticing only failure. These were not grand gestures, and perhaps that was why they mattered. They were uncomfortable adjustments. Evidence that he was learning to see labor as something done by humans rather than by an invisible system that existed to make his life smooth. One afternoon, she was called into the study again, and her body reacted before her mind did. A brief surge of tension she could not fully control. She stepped inside and stood rather than sitting. Standing reminded her she had legs, that she wasn't kneeling on marble anymore. The room smelled of cedar and leather, the scent of decisions, and the desk was clean in a way that suggested nothing messy was allowed to remain visible for long. "I spoke to HR," he said. The words sounded almost foreign in a house that usually handled staff matters as private discipline. "We're formalizing procedures. Not just reminders. Documentation that protects everyone." She didn't answer immediately. She had learned that policies could be written in beautiful language and still be used like weapons. "What does that mean for me?" she asked, voice even. "It means the warning is removed. Fully," he replied. "And it means if something goes missing, the investigation doesn't start with assumptions. It starts with facts." He hesitated, then added, "And pay adjustments for expanded duties will be standardized. No unofficial offers. No improvised corrections." The maid nodded once. She heard the effort in his phrasing. He was trying to build fairness into the system because he had finally seen how easily a system leaned toward whoever already had power. It didn't make him gentle. It made him slightly more just. That was not a miracle, but it was not nothing either. He slid a folder across the desk. Not an envelope this time. There's an opening, he said. Assistant supervisor for housekeeping operations. Inventory logs, scheduling support, training new staff with Elena. It's more pay, more stable hours. It's yours if you want it. The offer sounded safer than the last one, and still her caution rose. Oversight meant visibility. Visibility meant becoming part of the machinery that had harmed her. It also meant the chance to protect people like Sophia from becoming collateral when optics mattered more than truth. She looked at the folder without touching it. "Why are you offering it to me?" she asked. "Because you're competent," he said simply. "And because you don't disappear when something is wrong. That's rare." The words landed in her chest with a quiet, complicated weight. She thought of Sophia, who had risked her position to speak. She thought of Elena, who had survived by enforcing rules so hard she sometimes forgot they were meant to serve people, not erase them. She thought of Marisol, reassigned, now living inside the staff's memory as a warning about what happens when you help power manufacture a scapegoat. The maid understood that accepting a supervisory role could turn her into another Elena if she wasn't careful. It could also let her create a different kind of discipline, one that protected dignity instead of consuming it. "I'll consider it," she said, and meant it, not as delay, but as boundary. She had spent too long being rushed into decisions that served other people's comfort. "Because you're competent," he said simply, "and because you don't disappear when something is wrong. That's rare." The words landed in her chest with a quiet, complicated weight. She thought of Sophia, who had risked her position to speak. She thought of Elena, who had survived by enforcing rules so hard she sometimes forgot they were meant to serve people, not erase them. She thought of Marisol, reassigned, now living inside the staff's memory as a warning about what happens when you help power manufacture a scapegoat. The maid understood that accepting a supervisory role could turn her into another Elena if she wasn't careful. It could also let her create a different kind of discipline, one that protected dignity instead of consuming it. "I'll consider it," she said, and meant it, not as delay, but as boundary. She had spent too long being rushed into decisions that served other people's comfort. When she left the study, she found Elena in the corridor, clipboard in hand, posture still composed but no longer effortless. Elena's gaze met hers briefly, and in that moment the maid saw something she hadn't seen before: restraint. Not kindness, not apology, but the recognition that the maid had not been broken into compliance. Elena gave a curt nod, the smallest possible acknowledgement, as if conceding that survival did not have to require cruelty. Outside the mansion, her life improved in ways that were tangible and unromantic. She negotiated her schedule so she could attend one of her mother's medical appointments without begging. She spoke to her sister about money without shame, planning instead of panicking. She opened a savings account with a modest automatic transfer, small enough not to impress anyone in a mansion, large enough to make her feel less trapped. The money didn't erase worry. It bought choices, and choices brought a quiet kind of peace. She changed in ways no spreadsheet could capture, too. She stopped apologizing automatically when she hadn't done anything wrong. She learned to hold eye contact for one extra second, not as a challenge, but as a reminder that she existed. She began to speak to Sophia like an equal rather than like someone she needed to protect from truth. Sophia still carried fear, but she carried pride now as well, and the maid could see how that pride steadied her hands during difficult shifts. Integrity had cost Sophia comfort, but it had given her a spine. In the household, the shift continued. Staff began documenting found items carefully, not because they feared punishment, but because procedures no longer felt like traps. The associate who treated employees as disposable appeared less often, and when he did, he was quieter, as if someone had finally told him that arrogance left stains that even money could not polish away. The family member obsessed with optics kept her sharp elegance, but her instructions came more cautiously now, aware that the billionaire no longer found loose ends an acceptable description for human beings. Weeks later, the maid accepted the assistant supervisor role, not as a reward, but as a decision. She negotiated boundaries in plain language. She would not enforce humiliation as discipline. She would not tolerate gossip used as control. She would document procedures to protect staff as much as to protect the house. The billionaire agreed without enthusiasm, but he agreed. Agreement without enthusiasm was still progress in a place that once offered her only silence or replacement. On her first day in the new role, she walked the service corridor with a different kind of weight. Not fear. Responsibility, and responsibility felt cleaner when it was chosen. She saw Sophia sorting linens and allowed herself a brief smile. Sophia returned it without panic. She passed Elena and received another curt nod. She paused in the entryway where she had once knelt in spilled water and looked at the marble. Still shining, still cold, still indifferent. The house hadn't become kind. It had become more accountable, and she had become someone who would not trade dignity for convenience again. That evening, when she left the mansion, she did not feel rescued. She felt rearranged. Her life was still hers, still imperfect, still demanding, but it belonged to her more fully than it had before. She walked toward the bus stop with steady steps, aware that nothing about her future would be effortless, and that was fine. Effort was something she understood. What she wanted now was respect, consistency, and the right to be seen as human wherever she worked, and she had learned how to insist on that without begging.